Welcome to another edition of Radio Influencers, a podcast series we're doing for Radio Update. I'm your host, Andy Meadows. My consulting mentor, friend, and Radio Update contributor, Tracy Johnson, wrote another powerful article for us this week. He's great about getting them to me consistently ahead of time. So we've published an article from Tracy every Monday since we launched Radio Update a year ago last month. By the way, we'll have a birthday party episode coming up soon, looking back at our first year. In Tracy's article this week, he talked about how personal stories can make listeners love you, which I absolutely agree with. I've written about similar things as well. The hook as the key to great storytelling is a fairly recent one that comes to mind. By the way, if you noticed a parallel in the topics that I write and talk about and the topics Tracy Johnson writes and talks about, that's no coincidence. I've long admired Tracy's work. His morning radio book is one of my favorite overall radio books, and he's now got a morning radio revised edition, by the way, that's been updated. I will be eternally grateful that he took me under his wing when I started consulting and helped me learn the ropes, edited my first ebook for me, and even partnered with me in some markets, even though he knew I had already started my own consulting company as well, something very few people would do because most consultants would look at it like they're just creating a future competitor, and why would they want to do that? But back to his article, I absolutely agree that becoming a great storyteller is how you become a great on-air talent, or really any kind of great performer. However, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a lot of time, a lot of work, a willingness to be introspective, and you have to be a very good listener before you'll ever be a great storyteller, because you have to pay attention to what and how listeners respond and use that knowledge to adjust and evolve your process. All of that is why there are only a handful of great storyteller comics, a handful of great screenwriters and movie directors, and a handful of great radio on-air personalities. But yes, all of that can be coached by guys like Tracy and hopefully myself. I coach talent as well. But becoming a great storyteller is a long and arduous process. There is, however, a hack that can fast-track it. And that's what I want to talk about today. And it also has a side benefit for anyone in a management role that we'll also discuss. Incorporating icebreakers both on air and in meetings is what I would like to go into today. If you have any questions after watching or listening, email them to me at andy@radiostationconsultant.com or editor@radioupdate.com, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. First, let me tell you where I got this idea. Over the weekend, I read the New York Times The Morning newsletter containing an article entitled Breaking Through, written by Melissa Kirsch. The whole piece was about the value of icebreakers, and I found it really inspiring because I related to a lot of what she wrote. She talked about how she polled her friend group, and they all thought workplace bonding exercises were incredibly corny. And my wife and I have had this conversation many times because she's worked for a few companies that do a lot of these kind of team building things, and she hates them. I, being a consultant and a radio guy, like the team building stuff, but I absolutely agree that they can be a whip if they aren't strategic and purposeful. But I also really liked how Melissa tied it together by talking about how something as simple as an icebreaker at the top of a meeting can loosen everyone up and ultimately lead to a more productive meeting, which I'll come back to in a bit. One of my favorite things to do in air check sessions when coaching talent is to end with a brainstorming session where we talk about content ideas, which, by the way, only works if you've developed a good process for air checking talent. I've shared mine on radiostationconsulting.com, radiostationconsultant.com, and on radioupdate.com if you'd like to read it. So I'm always on the lookout for good content ideas to suggest in these meetings to get the ball rolling, and that's another reason this article caught my eye. In the article, Melissa talked about how she used icebreakers in meetings she led, especially during the COVID lockdown where we were all uncomfortable being thrust into remote working, many of us for the first time. So I encourage you to read it, but I'll also summarize some of it here, talk about how it applies to personalities and managers, and end with a few good example icebreakers and some bad ones that I wouldn't recommend using in any of these settings. On air. If we're doing radio right, then every day we're talking to new listeners, even if we've been on the same radio station in the same market and the same time slot for a long time. there are always going to be a varying percentage of people who are tuning in to hear us for the very first time. Because of that, we're always trying to do this really awkward balancing act of talking to people who've known us for years without boring them with too much of the same details and info they've heard us mention thousands of times, and including enough info so those brand new listeners we mentioned aren't confused or feeling left out. Because these are three of the main things that cause listener tune-out: bored, confused, excluded. That's why learning things like how to efficiently get into a break, effectively reset within a longer content break, and overall learning to self-edit and remove as many unnecessary words as possible are such valuable skills for an on-air personality. So using Icebreakers is a great tool to help us with that balancing act. Not only do they make great phone topics, something I wish all radio talent would get back to doing more of, because it forces us to engage and interact with listeners, which makes us all better at our jobs, but they also make great conversation starters with co-host and in-studio guests, because they tend to lead to interesting and very relatable conversations if they're crafted correctly. Meetings. It's no secret that I'm not a big fan of how meetings are conducted at most radio stations, and for that matter, most companies overall. Hence why I've written articles like Fix Your Staff Meetings. It's also why I sometimes schedule back-to-back meetings on purpose to make sure I have an out if a meeting that I thought would be productive turns out not to be productive. Because if we all agree that meetings are important, then clearly my next meeting is also important, so no one questions it or looks at you funny when you say, "Sorry, I've got another meeting." My main issue with meetings, by the way, is that there often isn't a point person, an agenda. They don't generally start on time, rarely ever end on time, and always include a few people that don't need to be there. Because of all of that, you would probably assume that I'm anti using something like a lighthearted icebreaker to open a meeting, but I'm not, and here's why. Productive meetings happen when people dial in and focus, and that's more likely to happen if the people in the meeting are all involved and genuinely connecting. A mass appeal, broad icebreaker that everyone in the meeting will have an answer to is a great way to set that tone at the top of a meeting, loosen everyone up, and get everyone dialed in. A few good example icebreakers. The first few of these came from the Melissa Kirsch article, and she mentioned she pulled a few from writer Rob Walker's The Art of Noticing newsletter. All of these would work well on air or in meetings, probably at a dinner party as well. What makes a good icebreaker is something everyone has an answer to. So as a test, as I read these, think about what your answer would be, and I'll tell you mine. What's the first thing you bought with your own money? So mine is New Kids on the Block cassette tape. That's super embarrassing. But in my defense, my parents owned a country station in a small market, so I could get all the country stuff for free, but I had to buy Hanging Tough if I wanted to listen to it. What were you doing at 23? I was doing nights at 95.9 The Ranch, and I know they may be the PD toward the end of me being 23 because some of the on-air talent I managed called me the 23-year-old behind my back when they were unhappy with something I asked them to do, and it bothered me after I turned 24 that they didn't update the nickname. What's something you're great at but hate? This one took me a second, but high jumping. So, or at least I used to be good at jumping. I'm probably not as well now that I'm 46, but I was never good at the flexibility part, so I would always dominate the lower level high jumping competitions, win things like district, and then choke in regionals because I couldn't touch my toes, and flexibility is a big part of high jumping, unfortunately. What are the most common things people say when you tell them your hometown? So sometimes I say Junction, Texas is my hometown because that's where I lived from 4 to 16. And if I say Junction, people usually say Junction Boys, the Junction Boys. It's depending on their age, because that's an old movie about how Bear Bryant used to take the Aggie football team to Junction for training camp to isolate them and turn them into real men or something. Then I think someone died and they stopped, but don't quote me on that last part. I could be wrong. Sometimes I say Kerrville because that's where I graduated high school. And when I say that, they usually bring up the Kerrville Folk Festival, which may or may not still be going on. I think it is. Here's another I've suggested it to talent as a phone topic, but would also make a good icebreaker. First band you saw live. Everybody has an answer to that, obviously. But here are a few bad examples of icebreakers that I definitely wouldn't use in a meeting, but may work on air. How did you meet your spouse? That can lead to some great stories, but can also bring up some bad memories for people that are divorced or widowed or never married, which will bring the room down in a meeting and probably isn't worth doing on air because it, especially in a morning show when you're trying to keep people in a good mood on their way to work. Last time you went off on a stranger, that is a good phone topic because it'll lead to some really funny stories, but not a good icebreaker for a meeting, of course, because it's too dark. Guilty pleasure restaurant or favorite late night eats. That might be awkward for anyone with an eating disorder or overeater, so I probably would avoid it in a meeting, especially where you don't know the folks. Although, again, a decent phone topic on the right kind of format. Lie you told your kid that backfired. Again, great phone topic, but probably not a good icebreaker if it's people you don't know that well because it's a little dark and not relatable to people without kids. Final thought. Like I said at the top, being a good listener is a big part of developing the storyteller skill set that Tracy talked about in his article. In my experience, you can't become a great storyteller without being a good listener. But listening to people make small talk is of no real value to any of us. Small talk is like a nervous tic that we all have when we're in an awkward or new situation where we don't know how to behave, respond, or interact. So we're really just using small talk to fill time until we think of something deeper to say or ask. That's why having a few icebreakers, like the examples we just ran through, is a good idea to loosen everyone up, get them past the small talk, and move us toward conversations that are of value to everyone involved, whether that's a listener or people in a meeting, and give us information we can act on and use. What do you think? Have you tried using icebreakers on the air, in meetings, or in ordinary everyday life situations? Email me at andy@radiostationconsultant.com or editor@radioupdate.com and let me know if that worked, how that worked, and maybe some other icebreakers you can suggest. As always, if you have some thoughts you'd like to share on this or any other hot radio topic, submit an article about it by emailing submissions@radioupdate.com. By the way, we do not edit editorials for opinion or any other thing. Like, we'll edit for grammar and some of the common stuff, but we like to share unbiased, unfiltered opinions from radio folks. Thanks for listening, watching, and reading. We'll be back next week with a new episode of Radio Influencers. Radio Influencers is a radio update production. New episodes are released on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern.